Okay, moving a little closer to home, the moon. There was an attempted landing of the first privately funded spacecraft to the moon let's see, it was the 11th of April. And so this is an Israeli mission. It was funded primarily through donations from a couple of billionaires, and then the Israeli Aerospace Agency gave about $5 million, so their total budget was about $100 million to try and land something on the moon. And that sounds like a lot of money, but other successful missions probably cost at least 5 times that and are funded by governments. So this is the first time this has happened. And so this was a view of the little lander. By the way, Beresheet is, let me back up here. Beresheet is, and I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation, but it's Hebrew for in the beginning. So this is the beginning of their space program. So there's a view of the people that were sort of, this was their brainchild, so helping put it together. And another semi-unique thing about this is they piggybacked on a commercial launch. So there was a launch of a US Air Force satellite and a communications satellite on a SpaceX Falcon 9. And they agreed to allow the Beresheet to hitchhike a ride. The good thing is they got off the ground and they didn't have to pay a whole lot of money. The bad thing is they got into a very bad orbit, because it's the orbit that they were dropped off in is for a communication satellite around the Earth, not going to the moon. And so they very cleverly came up with this mechanism where when you first launch, here you go, and every now and then you give a rocket firing down here, you speed up the spacecraft a little bit, you make the orbit more and more egg-shaped until you actually pump it up to be the distance of the moon. You time it so that it arrives at the moon when the moon is actually there, and then the moon's gravity takes over, and you do another rocket firing and you're in orbit at the moon. So these are the dates. It launched on February 22nd. By about a month later, they were in this orbit that would cross the path of the moon. They were captured in lunar orbit on the 4th of April, and then they attempted their landing on the 11th, so 2 weeks ago. So this is just a little animation of how they actually do these orbit maneuvers. Just the critical time, they fire the engines, the onboard main engine, and go into orbit. And so that succeeded on the 4th of April, and then on the 11th was when they tried their landing. And this was on the way between the Earth and the Moon, so this is sort of a selfie of the spacecraft. There's the Earth in the distance, and they've got this plaque on board saying "Small country, big dreams." And so here's what they were expecting to happen on the 11th. And in fact, everything started perfectly. They adjusted the orbit to where they'd actually be able to get down to the surface. This is a view from the spacecraft with the moon sort of hurtling toward them. And this is a telemetry screen, so the 8 little white circles here are the attitude control thrusters that control the direction of the spacecraft. And then this is the larger main engine. And if it's yellow, that means it's operating. If it's white, it's turned off. And so at this first point, they were 14 kilometers above the surface. They were dropping at about 25 meters per second and slowing. And they still had about a kilometer per second of horizontal velocity, so they needed to, they came in sort of tail first to slow down. And then, so there's a closer up view of that. That's a landing leg. And then they got down to about 6 kilometers above the surface. And they have 2 inertial measurement units, which tell it how fast it's going, what the orientation is. And one of those 2 devices crashed, if you will, and turned itself off. And in the course of doing that, it started giving bad information, or the other one was giving bad information, and you can see they started speeding up. Instead of being 20 meters per second, it was 100 meters per second. And they basically powered the spacecraft off and rebooted it, and the engine came back on. This was the last view from the spacecraft as it was descending. And at this point, the last measurement they got, they were 150 meters above the surface, and they were dropping at 130 meters per second. So it's like 500 kilometers per hour. And that was the last they heard of it. And it apparently, since they had cycled the engine off to do the reboot, they didn't have enough thrust left to actually slow it down enough to successfully land, and so it crashed. But it certainly, to that point, it was a very successful mission, and they've done things that no other privately funded group has ever attempted. And so the people involved, the one billionaire in particular that provided most of the funding, he says, we're going to go back. We're going to rebuild this. We'll do Beresheet 2 and take care of the problems and do this again. And so the real underlying purpose of this is to inspire children and teenagers and college students in Israel to actually follow careers in aerospace and or engineering, technical careers. So they certainly have pumped up the population.